The truth about the Spanish Conquest. The conquest is a historical event that divides opinions. For the Americans, it was a plunder, while for Europe it meant its expansion through colonization and evangelization. In this video, we will explore the details of how Christopher Columbus arrived in America, how the Spanish Conquest developed, and what were its impacts on the indigenous populations of America. After several failed attempts to obtain financial support from the Spanish monarchs, Christopher Columbus managed to obtain the sponsorship of Queen Isabel and King Ferdinand of Spain. Thus, he departed with 3 ships, whom he baptized as the Pinta, the Nina, and the Santa, along with his crew on August 3, 1492, from the Spanish port of Palos. After a journey full of difficulties due to storms, lack of food and water, they finally sighted land on October 12, 1492. Although Columbus believed he had arrived in the East Indies, he had actually discovered a new continent that would eventually be called America. The island where he landed was called Guanahani by the Taino natives who lived there. Columbus then visited other islands in the Bahamas and later explored the coasts of Cuba and Hispaniola, now Haiti and the Dominican Republic. Although he did not find the gold and riches he expected, his discovery had a huge impact on the world and paved the way for the conquest and colonization of America by European powers. After this discovery, Europeans began to explore and conquer new lands in search of wealth and resources. The Spanish conquest of America began with the arrival of Hernán Cortés in Mexico in 1519. Cortés and his men faced indigenous peoples in several battles but eventually managed to subdue the Aztec Empire and establish Spanish control over the region. The Spanish, along with other European conquerors, used advanced military tactics, such as cavalry and artillery, as well as diseases unknown to the indigenous peoples, to achieve victory in battles. The Spanish conquistador Francisco Pizarro also led an expedition to South America in 1532, where he conquered the Inca Empire. Like Cortés, Pizarro and his men used military superiority and tensions between different indigenous groups to their advantage. The Spanish also used religion as a means to impose their control and convert the indigenous peoples to Christianity. Despite the military and technological superiority of the Spanish, the conquest would not have been possible without the help of the indigenous peoples. The conquerors took advantage of tensions and divisions between different indigenous groups and managed to forge alliances with those who were against existing indigenous leaders. The Spanish also used indigenous labor to build infrastructure and work in the mines and plantations they established in America. These practices, along with the diseases that Europeans brought with them, had a devastating impact on indigenous populations, leading to a decrease in population and the loss of their traditional cultures and ways of life. The Spanish conquest had a dramatic impact on the indigenous populations of America. In their search for wealth and resources, the Spanish subjected many indigenous peoples to a regime of exploitation and servitude. Tribes that resisted were enslaved or exterminated, while those who submitted were subjected to extreme exploitation. In addition, the exploitation of America's natural resources and the introduction of new forms of work and production led to a collapse in the economies and traditional ways of life of indigenous societies. The Spanish also imposed their culture and religion on the indigenous populations, which had a lasting impact on the life and culture of these societies. The indigenous peoples were forced to adopt Christianity and abandon their own religious beliefs and practices, leading to a loss of cultural and religious identity. The Spanish language became the dominant language, and Spanish culture replaced many indigenous traditions. In addition, the imposition of Spanish culture also led to the elimination of many forms of indigenous art and culture. The Spanish conquest also had an impact on the health of the indigenous populations. Europeans brought with them unknown diseases to the indigenous peoples, such as smallpox, which devastated the indigenous populations of America. The lack of immunity and the precarious living conditions of the indigenous populations led to the rapid spread of diseases and the drastic reduction in population. In some cases, the decrease in the indigenous population was so great that entire societies disappeared forever. The Spanish conquest had an extremely negative impact on the indigenous population of America. The violent tactics and systematic exploitation of America's natural resources led to the enslavement, murder, and servitude of millions of people. Many indigenous tribes were decimated by European diseases such as smallpox, to which they had no immunity. The imposition of Spanish culture and religion often meant the suppression and destruction of indigenous cultures and traditions. The Spanish destroyed many important buildings and monuments of the indigenous societies of America and forced religious conversion and cultural assimilation on the indigenous populations. In addition, the Spanish conquest also had a long-term negative economic impact on America. The Spanish exploited America's natural resources, such as silver and gold, for their own benefit and to finance the expansion of their empire. This led to environmental degradation and large-scale exploitation of indigenous workers in mines and plantations. In conclusion, the Spanish conquest of America is a dark chapter in world history that left a profound and lasting impact on the indigenous populations of the continent. The conquest led to the destruction of entire societies and loss of human lives, leaving a legacy of pain and suffering that continues to affect indigenous populations to this day. Moreover, the Spanish conquest also had a long-term negative economic impact on the continent, as the exploitation of natural resources and enslavement of indigenous populations led to an economic decline in many areas. There was also a significant loss of cultural and linguistic diversity, as many indigenous cultures were suppressed and forced to adopt Spanish customs and language. It is important that we remember and recognize the history of the Spanish conquest of America and work together to address the inequalities and injustices that still exist today as a result of the conquest. We must strive to learn from history and work towards inclusion and respect for all cultures and societies in our world.